Hello friends, my name is Ash. This channel is more usually focused on the fun of costuming and live action roleplay. And this is one of a series of essays I'm releasing in honour of Pride Month, talking about issues that are important to me in relation to gender, clothing, and the costuming community. This is going to be heavier than my usual content, so if you prefer a more light-hearted video, I can recommend the one popping up in the cards now. So, I want to lead in by explaining that, personally, my gender is not fluid, but my presentation often is. And I think people really struggle with that. They want one gender to be the regular one and one to be the opposite. Or they expect everything I do to be somehow an ambiguous mix of the two. In reality, there's a few different places on the spectrum I feel really comfortable, and I bounce between them how I like. But my internal perception of my gender doesn't change whether I'm in Lolita or menswear. On social media, you only get a very narrow view of my life, and in particular, my normal everyday wardrobe doesn't feature very much. So, on any given day, I can be wearing one of several things. What I vaguely think of as House Goblin, which tends to be my more practical medieval kit, t-shirts and cozy skirts. It's my pandemic wardrobe. The more femme stuff, which is either casual Lolita or, I don't want to say Morgan Donna's SCA wardrobe, but it's getting out of hand. And then there's the menswear, which I have much less of, but I wear probably 75% of the time. I came very late to men's clothing I actually felt comfortable in. I can actually pinpoint the moment it happened. Early in the pandemic, YouTube was like, hey, watch this video. Kind of out of nowhere, and it was on Kinetic Manifesto film Come Prima by BTS. Yes, I know. And that was the first time in my life I was looking at men and going, that's it, that's what I want. That's the masculine version of me. That's what I want to look like. That's where I fit. Not in a creepy Ollie London way. Just now I've started really looking into menswear, having basically written it off as untenable for over a decade. A lot of my style icons now are men of colour doing street styles who are undeniably masculine, but they're doing it with colour and jewellery and nice fabrics. I like those things. Also, because of my size and body shape, I fit nothing made in the UK, and discovering Chinese, Korean, Japanese men's clothing sizing has been a revelation. That aspect of my wardrobe is still being developed, and I'm still figuring out what feels good. One thing I found works really well is saving images of outfits I really like. Like 50% of them are Jimin from BTS, don't at me, I have a problem. And then instead of trying to recreate specific outfits, I'm looking for trends. That's why I've gone for the earrings, because I saw them coming up a lot and my ears are already pierced, so here's something more masculine I can do with that. I really want to try some wide leg trousers because I've tried the skinny fit men's ones and they are not great when you have my waist to hip ratio. A bunch of the outfits I saw have a black polo neck jumper, so that's on the list for this autumn. That kind of thing helps me build a wardrobe rather than just a single outfit. I'm including this mainly as advice for other trans and non-binary people who are maybe trying to figure out their style. It's a good strategy. On the subject of wardrobes, I do occasionally get questions about why, if I can sew and obviously afford quite a lot of clothes, I end up wearing a lot of street style. A lot of people assume I should want to do vintage stuff or like dark academia just because I'm on CostTube. And while I can completely see why those aesthetics appeal to people, it's not my thing at all. I had the opportunity to do a lot of vintage sewing over the pandemic and I just didn't. Left to my own devices, I don't want that. I really appreciate that a lot of people are out there finding styles that really reflect them and who they are, and in most circumstances, providing you're not appropriating or co-opting anything that isn't yours, I think that choice about what you personally want your style to be should be a neutral one. It usually isn't, but in theory, going, this is the best reflection of who I truly am on the inside, probably shouldn't come with a lot of baggage. But I think that a lot of, well, often the audience rather than the influencers themselves tend to end up ranking some aesthetics as better than others. And they'll never say better. They'll say more flattering, smarter, more thoughtful, taking more care of your appearance. See how many things get described as more sustainable when they're just not. And when you filter and refine it all comes down to you look posh. In particular, I want to like dark academia, but everyone seems to swing it as, oh, I'm going to Oxbridge on daddy's credit card. That aesthetic of not just rich, but also classy. And no, I grew up in Oxford. No. I did ask once if a witch's cottage is cottagecore. Cottagecore is not exempt from this. Have you seen how much sulky dresses cost? Are you aware of how privileged it is to be able to access the natural world purely for leisure? If a witch's cottage is cottagecore, what aesthetic is a wizard's house? And the answer for most people was dark academia. And that's the aesthetic I want. But I just can't seem to catch the vibe of Howl Pendragon versus spoilt rich boy in tweed at the Bullington Club dinner. Gross. So I'm not touching it. And I think that's part of my problem, because everyone is like, ooh, vintage, ooh, dark academia, that's the aesthetic of CosTube. Those are aspirational aesthetics, and they haven't really unpacked that those aesthetics are very heavily associated with weird class dynamics. Obviously, poor people existed in vintage times, and wearing those aesthetics now is not automatically an indication of having lots of money or being upper class. This is largely not directed at the people wearing those clothes with nuance and integrity, but there's layers involved in going, why do you want to dress in modern street style? Why don't you want a three-piece suit? There's nothing wrong with wanting the three-piece suit. That should be a neutral decision. But when you go, but this three-piece suit is better than what your K-pop idols are wearing at the airport, I think you need to unpack exactly why you think that, because the kind of words people end up using are often deeply classist ones. Now, this whole gender thing ends up a bit skewed on this channel, because when it comes to historical and fantasy clothing, I am very, very often in camp high femme. No, really, more femme than that. The main exception being The Witcher. God, if I could look like Henry Cavill as Geralt, I'd be doing that way more often. But in general, I am making dresses, or extravagant flowing frilly things. And that is disproportionately what you see on this channel. This, I know, contributes to people perceiving me as female, even subconsciously, because I'm not androgynous enough to be really non-binary. The mental image most people have of a non-binary person is an apparently AFAB white person with short hair wearing masculine clothing. I know what I look like right now, just run with it. And before you jump to reassure me about that, I want you to sit with the fact that it's almost certainly the bias that you also have. There is a huge diversity of non-binary expression, and I say this as someone who quite often fits into that narrow box of what a non-binary person looks like. It would just be nice if more people could make a conscious effort to see me as non-binary when I am in full corset, bustle and petticoats, as when I look like this. Now, one way this expresses itself is that the historically correct silhouette is obviously very gendered, and this usually clashes significantly with my perception of my body. It's not uncommon for me to get helpful comments saying things like, oh, you could pad your bust more, you could do this to your body, you could do that, then your shape would be more correct. When I know I could do that. I am not doing those things because it gives me dysphoria. I am not putting this much time and effort and money into a costume that I don't want to wear because it fits the ideal female shape of that era, and that makes me feel awful. So I want to make the pretty dresses, but I also want to cut them with flat fronts. I sometimes want to wear them with my natural hair. I don't want to disguise my broad shoulders or my complete and total lack of cleavage. And I'm like, I'm making these clothes myself. I get to do that. But there's this perception that I am less historically accurate because I haven't created the right shape. And without unpacking the whole bullshit of ranking people according to how historically accurate they are, trans people existed in the past. Non-binary trans people existed, not just in other cultures that had existing structures for them to inhabit, that still do, but in white Christian Europe. Small digression on the subject of historical trans figures. I really recommend, whether you're trans or cis, educating yourself on people in history who may well have been trans. Obviously, we can't say for certain, but as a trans person, I have found so many experiences that resonated deeply with my own, in spite of existing at a time and place when allegedly those experiences shouldn't exist. I don't think I'd realized how much I lacked that sense of continuity and connection to history that I think a lot of other people experience until I started learning about people like me. There's a 19th century French writer called Rachilde who described their gender as not a woman, but a monster, a werewolf, or a cat. And if I know my audience, a lot of you are like, that's interesting, but kind of weird. And then there's like 3 people who are having a whole moment. Right there with you, Sib. For what it's worth, Rachilde's Wikipedia page is a disaster. My friend James, who is the source of a lot of my historical queer knowledge and runs, among other things, a project mapping historical crossdressers, recommends Rachel Mesh's book Before Trans if this is something you're interested in. But to circle back to talking about bodies, people with my body existed. People with not even dysphoria, just plain old cis people who felt uncomfortable changing the shape of their body in a particular way existed and still do. The whole concept of an ideal figure or ideal proportion trans for any given era is one I think we need to bury 6 feet under the ground and never speak of again, because saying, oh, but it's not real, it's all padding and support garments, does not make it okay. Not having the right shaped bust or waist or hips while wearing all the correct garments is historically accurate, and not having the right silhouette just needs to stop being something we judge people on. Every person who is concerning themselves on whether people are doing historical costume right needs to accept that their concept of what was right in the period is sexist, classist, fatphobic, ableist, and transphobic by design. You cannot separate the ideal figure of any given period from the prejudices that made it ideal. Why are you replicating those incredibly outdated historical attitudes? One final note on the body and historical costuming space. A lot of people in this space are cis women, and I think a lot of people assume that the majority of people in this space are cis women. A significant number of cis women in costuming act like they're in a space that's just women, and a significant number of cis women in costuming talk about their breasts a lot. It's a thing. And it's simultaneously true that as a trans person, that makes me super uncomfortable for dysphoria reasons. And it's almost certainly very misogynistic to be like, could you talk about boobs less? Both of these things are true. I guess what I want to say is, I don't want to police the way that you talk in your space or about your body, but try and think about your audience as being more diverse than just cis women. You may not want to change anything about what you do, but you should be aware that some conversations that are important to cis women and uncomfortable to cis men because of structural misogyny are also going to impact on trans people in ways you may not have considered. You may not want or be able to do anything about that, but I just think people need to be aware that it happens. If you'd like to show your support for the channel and the series, liking the video and subscribing to the channel is always welcomed. In the description box, you'll find a link to my Ko-fi, where you can make a financial contribution to support me and the channel. Dream big, and I'll see you next time.